The ballroom fell silent the moment Prince Edmund raised his hand and spoke the name that was not Clara's. Clara Bennett stood near the tall marble pillars at the edge of the crowd, holding a tray of folded papers she had been asked to deliver to the royal secretary. She was not a guest. She was staff, the quiet young woman who spent her days buried among old scrolls in the palace archive, far from chandeliers and silk gowns. She had only come into the ballroom because her superior had sent her on an errand, and she had not expected to walk straight into the moment that would break her heart in front of 300 people. "Lady Vivian Ashworth," Edmund announced, his voice steady and practiced, "will be my bride." The crowd erupted into applause. Somewhere a string quartet began to play. Servants moved through the room with trays of champagne, and nobles leaned toward each other to whisper about the match, about the alliance it would create between two powerful families, about how perfect the couple looked standing together beneath the golden light. Clara did not move. She could not. She had known Edmund since she was 19 years old, back when he used to sneak into the archive to escape his tutors and his duties, back when he would sit across from her at the long reading table and ask her questions about forgotten kings and forgotten wars. She had never told him how she felt. She had told no one, except Nathaniel, her closest friend since childhood, who worked as a groundskeeper on the palace estate, and who had warned her, gently and more than once, that hearts like hers rarely survived encounters with crowns. Lady Vivian stepped forward in a gown the color of deep red wine, her dark hair pinned with diamonds that caught the light every time she moved. She smiled at the crowd, but her eyes swept the room until they found Clara standing near the pillar, tray still in her hands. "Oh," Vivian said, loud enough for the nearest guests to hear, her smile sharpening. "Isn't that the little archive girl? The one who follows the prince around like a lost puppy?" A ripple of laughter moved through the small circle of nobles closest to her. Clara felt her face burn. She wanted to disappear into the marble floor, to become invisible the way she had spent most of her life trying to be. She had never asked for attention. She had never wanted to be seen. And now, in the space of a single sentence, Vivian had made her the object of every curious glance in the room. Edmund's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He did not defend her. He did not even look at her. He simply turned back to Vivian, offered his arm, and led her toward the center of the floor, where the first dance of the evening was about to begin. Clara set the tray down on a side table, with hands that were not quite steady, and walked out of the ballroom as quickly as she could without running. She kept her chin lifted, the way her mother had taught her to do whenever the world tried to make her feel small. But the moment she pushed through the heavy doors into the corridor outside, the tears came anyway, hot and sudden, and she pressed her back against the cold stone wall and let herself breathe. "Clara." She looked up. Nathaniel stood a few feet away, his work clothes still dusty from the garden, his expression already full of concern before she said a single word. He must have heard. News in the palace traveled faster than wind. "I'm fine," she said, wiping her face quickly. "You're not," Nathaniel said, stepping closer. "You don't have to pretend with me." Clara let out a shaky breath. "I knew this day was coming. I knew he would marry someone like her eventually. I just didn't think I'd have to stand there and watch it happen. I didn't think she would say that in front of everyone." "She's cruel," Nathaniel said quietly. "Everyone in this palace knows it. The only person who doesn't seem to notice is Edmund himself." Clara shook her head. "It doesn't matter what I think of her. It doesn't matter what I feel. None of it changes anything. I'm an archivist, he's a prince. That was always the end of the story, even before it began." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, and something in his eyes looked like he wanted to say more, wanted to tell her something, but he only reached out and squeezed her shoulder. "Go home. Rest. Tomorrow will feel a little less sharp, I promise." Clara nodded, though she did not quite believe him. She walked the long way back to the servants' quarters, avoiding the main halls where laughter still spilled out from the ballroom, avoiding anyone who might have seen her humiliation and wanted to comment on it. By the time she reached her small room, tucked above the east wing near the archive stairs, the tears had dried into something colder and heavier, something that felt less like sadness and more like resignation. She did not know, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling that night, that behind the walls of the palace an old woman with silver hair and sharp, watchful eyes had also witnessed the scene in the ballroom. Queen Margaret had seen everything. She had seen the announcement, she had seen Vivian's cruel words, and most importantly, she had seen Clara's face in the instant before the young woman turned to leave. It was not sympathy that made Margaret's chest tighten as she watched, it was recognition. For years, Margaret had kept a secret buried so deep that she had almost convinced herself it belonged to another lifetime, another woman's memory rather than her own. She had first noticed it 3 years earlier, quite by accident, during a routine review of the palace household records. A name in an old ledger, a birth recorded decades ago under strange and hurried circumstances. A family line that had vanished from official record books not because it died out, but because someone had wanted it to disappear. She had followed the thread quietly ever since, piecing together fragments from documents that had been locked away in the deepest part of the royal vault. Documents that very few people even knew existed. Clara Bennett was not simply an orphan who had been raised in a modest home near the coast, and later found work in the palace archive because of her sharp memory and steady hands. Clara Bennett, if Margaret's research was correct, carried blood far older and far more important than anyone in that ballroom could have imagined, including Clara herself. Margaret had said nothing to anyone, not to her son, not to her advisors. She was not yet certain enough to speak, and she understood better than most the danger of revealing a truth like this before it was fully proven. Truths like this had a way of getting people hurt. She had seen it happen once before, many years ago, and she had no intention of letting history repeat itself carelessly. But watching Clara walk out of that ballroom with her head held high despite the humiliation burning in her eyes, Margaret felt something shift inside her. She could not keep pretending she did not know. She could not keep letting a young woman with no idea of her own worth serve tea and file paperwork, while a calculating stranger prepared to take a crown that, by every right of blood, did not belong to her. Margaret rose from her seat near the ballroom's upper balcony, where she had watched the evening unfold from a discreet distance, and made her way toward her private study. She needed to see the documents again. She needed to be certain before she did anything that could not be undone. Down in the archive, long after the ballroom had emptied and the candles had burned low, Clara sat at her desk, unable to sleep, and pulled out an old leather journal that had belonged to her mother. It was the only possession she had left from her childhood, filled with faded handwriting and pressed flowers between the pages. She often read it when she needed comfort, tracing her fingers over her mother's careful script, imagining a woman she barely remembered. Tonight, for the first time, she noticed something she had never noticed before. Tucked into the very back pages, behind a section she had always assumed was blank, was a folded piece of paper, brittle with age, sealed with a wax stamp she did not recognize. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it up to the candlelight. She did not open it, not yet. Something about the seal, about the strange formal crest pressed into the wax, made her hesitate, a small voice inside her whispering that once she broke it open, there would be no going back to the quiet, uncomplicated life she had built for herself. She placed the journal back in its drawer, blew out the candle, and lay in the darkness with her heart pounding, unaware that across the palace, in a locked study lined with ancient records, Queen Margaret was staring at a matching seal pressed into the corner of a decades-old document, whispering a name under her breath that had not been spoken aloud in the palace for over 20 years. Clara's name. Morning came too soon for Clara. She rose before the sun, as she always did, and made her way down to the archive through corridors still quiet with sleep. The stone floors were cold beneath her shoes, and the smell of old paper and ink greeted her the moment she pushed open the heavy wooden door of the archive room. It was the one place in the palace where she felt she truly belonged, surrounded by shelves that stretched to the ceiling, each one packed with the forgotten stories of people who had come and gone long before her. She tried to focus on her work, sorting through a stack of correspondence that needed to be catalogued, but her mind kept drifting back to the ballroom, to Vivian's sharp smile, to Edmund's silence. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself that today would be no different from any other day, that she would file her papers and eat her simple lunch and go home at dusk the same as always. She almost believed it, until the archive door opened and Edmund himself stepped inside. He looked different in the morning light, less like the prince who had stood beside Vivian the night before, and more like the young man who used to visit her table with ink stains on his fingers and questions about history burning in his eyes. He hesitated near the entrance, as though unsure whether he was welcome. "Clara," he said quietly. She kept her eyes on the papers in front of her. "Your Highness." "Don't," he said, a flicker of something like pain crossing his face. "Don't call me that, not you." "It is your title," she said simply. "It is not my place to forget it." Edmund crossed the room slowly and stopped on the other side of her desk, the same spot where he had once spent countless afternoons. "I wanted to explain." "You don't owe me an explanation," Clara said, though her voice wavered slightly. "You are to be married. That is your duty, and I understand duty." "Vivian should not have said what she said," Edmund continued, his voice low. "I should have said something. I should have stopped her. I didn't, and I regret it." Clara finally looked up at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. There was so much unsaid between them, years of quiet afternoons and half-finished conversations that had never been allowed to become anything more. But duty was duty, and crowns did not bend for feelings that had never been given the chance to grow. "You should go," Clara said softly, "before someone notices you standing here." Edmund lingered a moment longer, then nodded and turned toward the door. Just before he left, he glanced back at her one last time, as though he wanted to say something else, something he could not quite find the courage to speak. Then the door closed, and Clara was alone again with her papers and her aching heart, unaware that the folded letter hidden in her mother's journal was about to change everything she believed about who she truly was. The letter burned in Clara's mind for 3 days before she found the courage to open it. She had carried it with her everywhere, tucked inside the pocket of her dress, feeling its weight against her hip like a stone she could not put down. Every time she reached for it, her fingers trembled, and every time she told herself she was being foolish, that it was probably nothing more than an old note from her mother to a forgotten friend, she found another reason to wait. It was Nathaniel who finally convinced her to open it. They sat together on the low stone wall behind the garden shed, the one place in the palace grounds where they had always gone as children to talk without being overheard. The late afternoon sun slanted golden through the trees, and somewhere in the distance a bell rang out the hour, but neither of them moved. "You've been carrying that letter around like it might explode," Nathaniel said, watching her turn it over in her hands for what must have been the 100th time. "I'm afraid of what it might say," Clara admitted. "Or you're afraid of what it might change," Nathaniel said gently. "But Clara, whatever it says, you're still you. Nothing written on that paper can take that away." Clara looked at him for a long moment, drawing strength from the steadiness in his eyes, and then, before she could talk herself out of it again, she broke the wax seal. The paper inside was thin and yellowed, the handwriting careful and formal, unlike her mother's looping script. It was not a letter from her mother at all. It was a document, official in nature, bearing a crest Clara did not recognize at the top, a crest with 3 interlocking rings beneath a small crown. As she read, her breath grew shallow, her hands grew colder, and the words on the page began to blur together into something she could not quite process. The document spoke of a child born in secrecy, moved from the capital under the cover of night, placed with a trusted family along the coast, to protect her from a danger the paper did not fully explain. It spoke of a bloodline that had once stood far closer to the throne than anyone now living could imagine, a line that had been deliberately erased from official record for the child's own safety. And at the bottom of the page, beneath a signature Clara did not recognize, was a single line that made her heart stop entirely. The child's name, given at birth before it was changed to protect her, was written in careful ink. It was not Clara Bennett. It was a name that matched, almost exactly, a name Clara had once seen etched into an old portrait hanging in the farthest, dustiest corner of the palace archive, a portrait of a princess who had supposedly died as an infant nearly 25 years ago. "Clara," Nathaniel said softly, noticing the color drain from her face. "What is it? What does it say?" She could not speak. She simply handed him the paper, her hands shaking so badly that he had to steady them with his own. Nathaniel read in silence, his eyes widening with each line, and when he finally looked up at her, there was something in his expression she had never seen before, a mixture of disbelief and dawning understanding. "This can't be real," he whispered. "It has to be a mistake," Clara said, finally finding her voice, though it came out cracked and unsteady. "Someone made an error. Names get confused. Documents get mixed up. This isn't possible." But even as she said the words, some quiet part of her recognized the truth settling over her like a heavy blanket she had never asked to wear. It explained things she had never questioned before, small things she had always dismissed as coincidence. The way certain older servants sometimes looked at her strangely, as though they recognized something in her face they could not quite place. The way Queen Margaret, on the rare occasions their paths crossed in the corridors, would pause and study her a moment too long, before continuing on her way. The way she had always felt, without ever understanding why, like she did not fully belong to the quiet life she had built. That evening, unable to sleep, unable to sit still in her small room above the archive stairs, Clara wandered the palace grounds long after the last lanterns had been extinguished. She told herself she was simply trying to clear her head, but her feet carried her, almost without her permission, toward the private wing where Queen Margaret kept her study. She did not intend to speak to the Queen. She only wanted to walk, to think, to try to make sense of a truth too large for her mind to hold. But as she rounded the final corridor, she saw a thin line of candlelight glowing beneath the study door, and she heard, faintly, the sound of someone speaking softly to themselves inside. She should have turned away, she knew that. It was not her place to be there, not at this hour, not near the Queen's private rooms. But something kept her feet rooted to the spot, and before she could stop herself, she heard the Queen's voice through the door, quiet but clear. 25 years, Margaret was saying, her voice heavy with something that sounded almost like grief. 25 years I let everyone believe she was gone. I told myself it was to protect her. But how much longer can I keep pretending I don't know? The truth is standing in my own archive. Clara's heart pounded so loudly she was certain it could be heard through the door. She took a step back, then another, meaning to retreat quietly the way she had come. But her shoulder brushed against a decorative vase resting on a nearby table, and it wobbled, then crashed to the floor in a shattering of porcelain that echoed through the silent corridor like thunder. The study door opened almost instantly. Queen Margaret stood in the doorway, candle in hand, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes widening with shock as they landed on Clara, standing frozen among the broken pieces of porcelain. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The candlelight flickered between them, casting long shadows against the stone walls, and Clara felt, for the first time in her life, as though she were looking at someone who already knew every secret she had just discovered. "You heard," Margaret said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara swallowed hard. "I don't know what I heard. I don't know what any of this means." Margaret studied her for a long moment, taking in the letter still clutched in Clara's trembling hand, the fear and confusion written plainly across her face. Then, slowly, the Queen stepped back from the doorway and gestured for Clara to enter. "Come inside," she said quietly. "It is time you learned the truth about who you really are." Clara hesitated only a moment before stepping over the broken porcelain and crossing the threshold into the Queen's private study, unaware that the moment she walked through that door, she was leaving her old life behind forever. Inside, the room was warm with candlelight and lined floor to ceiling with old books and locked cabinets. Margaret moved to a heavy wooden desk in the corner and unlocked a drawer with a small brass key she kept on a chain around her neck. She withdrew a thick folder, worn soft at the edges from years of handling, and set it carefully on the desk between them. "Sit down, child," Margaret said, and though her voice remained steady, there was a tremor beneath it that Clara had never heard from the Queen before. "What I am about to tell you will change everything you believe about your life. I need you to listen carefully, and I need you to understand that everything I did to keep you safe." Clara sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her heart hammering against her ribs, as Margaret opened the folder and began, at last, to speak the truth that had been buried for 25 long years. "Your mother did not simply give you up for adoption," Margaret began. "She was forced to hide you, to protect you from a danger that still, to this day, I am not entirely certain has passed. You were born into this family, Clara, not distantly, not by some faint and forgotten branch. You were born the daughter of a princess who the entire kingdom believes died as an infant, taken in the night to keep you from those who wished to see the true bloodline erased entirely." Clara's vision blurred with tears she did not fully understand. Why would anyone want to hurt a child? Margaret's expression darkened. Because bloodlines mean power, and power is something certain people are willing to do terrible things to protect, or to steal. There were those in this palace, decades ago, who believed the throne belonged to a different branch of the family entirely. When your mother, the true heir, gave birth to you, they saw an opportunity to remove that threat permanently. Your grandmother and I worked together to hide you before anyone could act on those intentions. We staged your death. We placed you with a trusted family along the coast. And then, Clara, your grandmother died within the year, taking most of the truth with her, and I was left as the only person alive who knew you still existed. Why didn't you ever tell me? Clara asked, her voice breaking. Because the danger never fully disappeared, Margaret said softly. Because I did not know, until recently, whether it was safe to bring you back into the light. I have spent the last 3 years quietly confirming what I always suspected, gathering proof, watching you from a distance, waiting for the right moment. I did not expect that moment to arrive the same week my son announced his engagement to a young woman I have never trusted. Clara sat in stunned silence, the weight of everything Margaret had said pressing down on her like the walls of the study were closing in. She thought of the portrait in the archive, the princess who supposedly died as an infant, the strange looks from older servants, the letter hidden in her mother's journal. Pieces that had never made sense before were suddenly falling into place with a clarity that frightened her more than any confusion ever had. "What happens now?" Clara whispered. Margaret reached across the desk and took Clara's cold hands in her own weathered ones. Now, child, we must decide together how much of this truth the world is ready to hear, and how much longer we can afford to wait before it is spoken aloud. Outside the study window, the palace slept on, unaware that within its walls, a secret 25 years buried had finally begun to stir, and that nothing in the kingdom would ever be quite the same again. Clara did not return to her room that night. She stayed in the Queen's study long past midnight, listening as Margaret filled in the pieces of a story that had been hidden from her for as long as she could remember. She learned that her mother, the true heir, had been quietly moved to a distant estate after Clara's birth, where she lived under a different name until her death some years later, never able to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her, never able to hold her daughter again for fear of exposing her. "She loved you," Margaret said, her voice thick with old grief. "Every letter she wrote me asked only one question: is she safe? Is she happy? She never once asked to see you, because she understood that seeing you meant risking everything we had built to protect you." Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. All those years she had believed herself abandoned, unwanted, a child left behind by a mother who could not be bothered to keep her. The truth was so different, so much heavier, that she hardly knew how to hold it. "What about the danger you mentioned?" Clara asked eventually, wiping her eyes. "Is it still real? Are the people who wanted to hurt me still here, in this palace?" Margaret's expression grew careful, guarded in a way, that told Clara the Queen was weighing exactly how much to say. "I cannot be certain. The family that once sought to remove your bloodline from the succession has changed over the generations, some branches fading into obscurity, others gaining new influence. I have my suspicions about who might still pose a threat, but suspicion is not proof, and I will not accuse anyone without certainty. What I can tell you is that until we are ready to reveal your identity to the court, you must continue exactly as you are. No one beyond this room, beyond your friend Nathaniel, and beyond myself, can know what we have discussed tonight." Clara nodded slowly, though the weight of the secret already felt almost too heavy to carry. "And Edmund, does he know?" Something flickered across Margaret's face, quick and unreadable. "My son knows nothing of this, and for now, that is how it must remain." Clara thought of Edmund standing in the archive that morning, his voice soft with regret, his eyes searching hers for something he had not been able to name. She thought of the engagement announcement, of Vivian's cruel smile, of the crown that would soon rest on a stranger's head unless something changed. The irony of it all pressed against her chest until she could hardly breathe. The crown that Vivian was so desperate to claim through marriage might, by right of blood alone, already belong to Clara. "I don't want power," Clara said quietly. "I never asked for any of this. I just wanted a quiet life." "I know," Margaret said, her voice gentle, "and I am sorry that the world has decided otherwise, but Clara, sometimes the truth does not wait for us to be ready. It arrives when it arrives, and all we can do is decide how bravely we choose to meet it." By the time Clara finally left the study, the eastern sky had begun to lighten with the first pale hints of dawn. She walked back to her room in a daze, the folder of documents Margaret had given her clutched tightly against her chest, her mind spinning with everything she had learned. She did not sleep. She simply sat by her window and watched the sun rise over the palace grounds, wondering how a single night could have changed the entire shape of her life, and wondering, with a fear she could not quite shake, how much longer the truth could possibly stay hidden. Lady Vivian slammed the door of her private chamber hard enough to rattle the windows, and Duke Harold, her father, barely flinched. He had seen his daughter's temper flare 1,000 times before, and he had long since learned that the only way to survive it was to remain perfectly still until the storm passed on its own. "He is spending time with that archive girl again," Vivian snapped, pacing the length of the room in her silk robe, her dark hair still pinned from the morning's fitting for her wedding gown. "I heard it from 3 different servants. He goes to her every chance he gets, and he thinks no one notices." "It means nothing," Harold said calmly, seated in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "The engagement is announced. The contracts are being finalized as we speak. A prince may indulge in whatever foolish nostalgia he wishes before his wedding, so long as he stands at that altar on the appointed day." "It is not nostalgia," Vivian said sharply. "I saw the way he looked at her the night of the ball, even while standing beside me. I will not spend the rest of my life married to a man who is still in love with a servant." Harold's expression did not change, though something calculating flickered behind his eyes. "Then perhaps it is time we ensured the archive girl finds somewhere else to work, somewhere far from this palace." Vivian stopped pacing and turned to face her father, a slow, cold smile spreading across her lips. Yes, that would solve the problem quite neatly, wouldn't it? What neither of them knew, as they plotted quietly in the warmth of that firelit room, was that this marriage had never been about love for either of them, not truly. Duke Harold had spent the better part of a decade maneuvering his family closer to the throne, forging alliances, calling in old favors, positioning his daughter as the ideal match for a prince desperate to please a kingdom that expected him to marry well and marry soon. Vivian, for her part, cared little for Edmund himself. She cared for the crown that would one day rest upon her head, for the power and status that came with being queen, for the chance to finally outshine every noblewoman who had ever looked down on her family's newer, less distinguished title. Love had never entered into their calculations, only ambition. Meanwhile, across the palace grounds, Edmund found himself unable to concentrate on the stack of state documents his advisors had left for his review. His mind kept drifting back to the archive, to Clara's careful, guarded expression when he had tried to explain himself, to the years of quiet friendship he had never allowed himself to name as anything more, out of duty, out of fear, out of the simple, exhausting weight of knowing his life had never truly belonged to him. He had been raised since childhood to understand that his marriage would be a matter of state, not of the heart. He had accepted that fate, the way one accepts weather, something beyond control, something to be endured, rather than questioned. But standing in the archive that morning, looking into Clara's eyes, he had felt something crack open inside him that he had spent years carefully sealing shut. He rose from his desk and walked to the window, staring out over the palace gardens where the late afternoon light stretched long shadows across the neatly trimmed hedges. Somewhere out there, Vivian was likely finalizing wedding preparations she cared more about than she cared about him. Somewhere in the archive, Clara was likely bent over her desk, cataloging old letters with the same quiet diligence she brought to everything she did. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. His personal attendant entered and bowed briefly. "Your Highness, the Duke has requested an audience regarding the wedding arrangements." Edmund sighed and nodded. "Send him in." Duke Harold entered a few moments later, all practiced charm and easy smiles, the kind of man who had built an entire career on knowing exactly what to say to whom. He settled into the chair across from Edmund's desk without waiting to be invited to sit, a small but deliberate assertion of familiarity. "Your Highness, I wish to discuss the timeline for the wedding," Harold began smoothly. "Vivian and I believe it would be wise to move the ceremony forward. The political climate favors a swift union, and there is no reason to delay what has already been decided." Edmund frowned slightly. The wedding was set for 6 months from now, to allow proper preparation. "Circumstances change," Harold said, his smile never wavering. "There are certain advantages to solidifying this alliance sooner rather than later. Rivals to your family's influence grow bolder every season we wait. A swift wedding sends a message of strength and unity." Edmund studied the Duke carefully, sensing something beneath the polished words that felt less like political strategy and more like urgency, though he could not quite place why. "I will consider it," he said finally, "but I will not be rushed into a decision as significant as my own wedding date without proper discussion with my mother and the council." Harold's smile tightened almost imperceptibly before he recovered it. "Of course, Your Highness. I only wish to see this union succeed as swiftly and smoothly as possible." After the Duke left, Edmund sat alone in his study for a long while, an uneasy feeling settling in his chest that he could not quite name. Something about the conversation felt wrong, though he could not point to any single detail that explained why. He thought of Vivian's cold smile at the ball, of her cruel words to Clara, of the calculating way she watched every room she entered as though measuring exactly how much power it contained. He was still lost in thought when his mother entered without knocking, her expression more serious than he had seen it in years. "Edmund," Margaret said, closing the door behind her, "we need to speak. It concerns your engagement, and it concerns a matter I have kept from you far longer than I should have." Edmund straightened in his chair, sensing immediately that whatever his mother had come to say was not going to be simple. "What is it?" Margaret hesitated, her hands folding together in front of her, a rare display of uncertainty from a woman who had ruled beside his father for decades with unshakable composure. "There is a truth I have carried for 25 years, one that I believe is finally ready to come into the light. But before I tell you, I need you to promise me that you will listen with an open mind, and that you will not act rashly on what I am about to say." Edmund's stomach tightened with a strange sense of foreboding. "Mother, you're frightening me." "Good," Margaret said quietly, "because what I am about to tell you should frighten all of us, and it will change everything about the path you believe your life is meant to take." She sat down slowly across from him, and for the second time that week, Queen Margaret prepared to speak a truth that had been buried for a quarter of a century. Unaware that in the archive across the grounds, Clara Bennett sat at her desk, staring at the folder of documents Margaret had given her, wondering how much longer she could pretend to be simply an archivist, while the entire foundation of her identity had shifted beneath her feet. The following days passed in a strange, suspended tension for Clara. She continued her work in the archive as though nothing had changed, sorting letters and cataloging records with hands that no longer felt entirely steady. Nathaniel checked on her often, bringing small kindnesses, a warm meal left quietly on her desk, a few minutes of easy conversation that reminded her she was still herself beneath the weight of everything she had learned. "You look tired," he told her one afternoon, leaning against the archive doorway with dirt still smudged across his forearms from his work in the gardens. "I haven't been sleeping well," Clara admitted. "Understandable," Nathaniel said, stepping inside and lowering his voice, though the archive was empty at that hour. "Has the Queen said anything more about when the truth might come out?" Clara shook her head. "She said we must be careful. She said there could still be danger, people who would not want the truth known. I don't even know who to be afraid of." Nathaniel's expression grew serious. "Then be careful of everyone, at least for now. Trust only the Queen, and trust me." Clara managed a small, tired smile. "I do trust you, Nathaniel. I don't know what I would have done these past few days without you." He studied her for a moment, something warm and steady in his gaze, before he seemed to catch himself and looked away, clearing his throat. "You'd have managed. You're stronger than you think, Clara. You always have been." Before Clara could respond, footsteps echoed from the corridor outside, and a moment later, Lady Vivian appeared in the archive doorway, her expression cold as she surveyed the room, her eyes settling on Clara with open disdain. "I was told I might find some old family records here," Vivian said, her voice sharp and imperious. "Records concerning marriages and lineage within the royal household. I trust you are capable of locating such things, given that filing papers seems to be the extent of your usefulness around here." Clara felt Nathaniel stiffen beside her, but she kept her own expression carefully neutral, years of quiet discipline steadying her voice even as her heart began to pound. "What specific records are you looking for, my lady?" Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly, studying Clara with an intensity that made the archivist's skin prickle with unease. "Records from approximately 25 years ago. Births, deaths, anything unusual regarding the royal family during that period. I have heard whispers that certain documents from that time were sealed away, hidden from public record. I intend to find out why." Clara's blood ran cold. She kept her face perfectly still, though every instinct screamed at her to react, to give something away. "I am not aware of any sealed records from that period, my lady. The archive holds only what has been officially catalogued." "How convenient," Vivian said, her voice dripping with suspicion, "that the one person who would know exactly where such records were hidden claims ignorance the moment I ask about them." "I assure you," Clara said carefully, "I have no reason to hide anything from you." Vivian stared at her a moment longer, and Clara had the distinct, unsettling feeling that the noblewoman could see straight through the careful composure she was fighting so hard to maintain. Finally, Vivian turned on her heel and swept out of the archive without another word, leaving Clara and Nathaniel standing in tense silence. "She suspects something," Nathaniel said quietly once Vivian's footsteps had faded down the corridor. "She's fishing," Clara said, though her voice trembled slightly. "She doesn't know anything specific. She can't." "Are you certain?" Nathaniel asked. Clara opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, because in truth, she was not certain at all. Somewhere in the palace, a secret 25 years buried was beginning to stir, and it seemed that Vivian, with her sharp eyes and her cold ambition, had already caught the first faint scent of it. That evening, Queen Margaret finished telling her son the truth she had carried for 25 years. Edmund sat in stunned silence long after she finished speaking, his mind struggling to reconcile the story his mother had told him, with everything he thought he understood about his own life and his own family. "Clara," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "Clara is my cousin, the daughter of the aunt I never knew existed." "Yes," Margaret said quietly, "and she is the rightful heir, ahead of me in the line of succession, had the truth never been hidden." "Yes," Margaret said again, watching her son carefully. Edmund pressed his hands against his face, trying to steady the storm of thoughts crashing through his mind. He thought of every conversation he had ever shared with Clara in the archive. Every moment he had told himself meant nothing more than simple friendship. Every feeling he had buried beneath the weight of duty, because he believed she was simply a servant, and he was simply a prince bound to marry where politics required. None of it had been simple at all. All along, without either of them knowing it, they had been bound together by blood far more significant than either had imagined. "Does she know how I feel about her?" Edmund asked quietly, almost to himself. Margaret studied her son with something gentle in her expression. "I believe she has always known, in her own quiet way, just as I believe you have always known how she feels about you. Neither of you ever allowed yourselves to speak it aloud, because you each believed the gap between your worlds was too wide to cross." "And now?" Edmund asked. "Now," Margaret said carefully, "you are engaged to a woman whose father grows more suspicious by the day, and the truth of Clara's identity is a secret that cannot remain buried much longer. Vivian has already begun asking questions in the archive. It will not be long before she or her father finds a thread to pull that unravels everything we have worked so hard to protect." Edmund's expression hardened with sudden resolve. "Then perhaps it is time the truth stopped being something we protect and started being something we use to protect Clara instead." Margaret regarded her son with a mixture of pride and concern. "It is not so simple, Edmund. The moment Clara's identity becomes known, she becomes a target, not just of political rivals, but potentially of whoever sought to remove her from the succession 25 years ago. We must move carefully, and we must move together, or we risk losing her the moment we are close to finally protecting her." Edmund nodded slowly, though the fire in his eyes did not fade. "Then we move carefully. But we move, Mother. I will not stand by and watch her hide in the shadows of this palace for one more day than necessary, especially not while I am forced to stand beside a woman who sees her only as an obstacle to remove." Outside the window, the sun had long since set, and somewhere across the palace grounds, in a small room above the archive stairs, Clara lay awake once again, staring at the ceiling, unaware that the two people with the greatest power to change her fate had just made a quiet decision that would soon set the entire kingdom on a collision course toward the truth. Vivian's fingers trembled with barely contained fury as she stood in the hidden storage room beneath the west wing, a room she had bribed her way into after weeks of quiet investigation, surrounded by dust-covered crates and forgotten furniture draped in white cloth. She had not found what she was looking for in the main archive, not with Clara guarding it so carefully. But a palace as old as this one had more than one place where secrets could be tucked away, and Vivian had spent enough years navigating the treacherous waters of noble politics to know that the most important truths were rarely kept where anyone might easily stumble upon them. It was Duke Harold who had finally located the old steward, a man long retired from active service but still living in a modest cottage near the palace outskirts, a man who had worked in the household 25 years earlier, and who, after a generous sum of money changed hands, proved willing to share fragments of memory he had carried in silence for decades. There was a birth, the old steward had told Harold, his voice trembling with age and old fear. A secret birth, kept from the public record. The princess, the young one everyone believed had died as an infant. I heard the midwife speak of it once, years later, before she too passed. The child did not die. She was sent away, hidden somewhere along the coast, given a new name to protect her from those who wished the true bloodline gone. Harold had relayed this information to his daughter with a satisfaction that bordered on triumph, and Vivian, standing now amid the dusty crates of the storage room with a small bundle of old records she had managed to locate, felt that same triumph coursing through her veins as she unfolded a faded document bearing a name that confirmed everything the old steward had claimed. Clara Bennett, the archive girl, the quiet, unremarkable young woman who filed papers and organized old letters and who Edmund could not seem to stop visiting despite his engagement to another. Vivian had suspected something the moment she noticed the way Edmund's eyes lingered on Clara during the ball, the way his composure cracked, however briefly, whenever the young archivist's name was mentioned. She had assumed it was simple infatuation, an inconvenient attachment that would fade once the wedding proceeded. She had never imagined the truth was so much larger, so much more dangerous to her own ambitions. Clara Bennett was the true heir to the throne, ahead of Edmund himself in the line of succession. A secret buried for 25 years, to protect a bloodline that everyone had believed extinguished. If this truth came to light, everything Vivian had worked toward, every careful maneuver, every calculated smile, every year spent positioning herself as the perfect match for a future king, would collapse into nothing. She would not become queen. She would become nothing more than a footnote in a story that belonged to someone else entirely. She could not allow that to happen. "We must act quickly," Vivian said to her father later that evening, pacing the length of his study with the stolen documents clutched tightly in her hands. Before this truth reaches the council, before it reaches the public, we must discredit her, or remove her from the palace entirely, before anyone has the chance to confirm what we already know. Harold studied his daughter with a calculating expression, weighing the risks of the path she proposed. Discrediting her will be difficult without revealing that we ourselves uncovered the truth of her identity, which would raise more questions than it answers. No, Vivian, we must be more careful than that. We must find a way to expose her as a fraud, a schemer who invented this story to steal the throne for herself, rather than allow the truth to stand as truth at all. Vivian's eyes lit with cold understanding. You mean we twist the story before anyone else has the chance to confirm it honestly? Precisely, Harold said. If the court believes Clara Bennett fabricated this claim to seduce her way into royal favor, using forged documents and false testimony, then her legitimate bloodline, however real it may be, becomes irrelevant. No one crowns a woman the court believes to be a liar and a schemer, regardless of what blood runs through her veins. Vivian smiled slowly, the expression cold and calculating in the dim candlelight of her father's study. Then let us begin building that story immediately. I want every servant, every noble, every corner of this court whispering about the Archive girl's desperate lies before the week is through. Neither of them noticed the shadow that shifted briefly outside the study's cracked door, nor the careful, quiet footsteps that retreated down the corridor moments later, carrying word of their conspiracy toward the one person who could still stop them before their plan took root. Nathaniel had followed Vivian into the West Wing out of simple caution, worried after her strange questions in the Archive days earlier, and what he overheard in the shadows outside Duke Harold's study sent him running through the palace corridors, faster than he had ever moved in his life, his heart pounding with dread as he made his way toward the Archive stairs, praying he would reach Clara before it was too late to warn her. He found her exactly where he expected, bent over her desk in the quiet of the evening, cataloging letters by candlelight. She looked up in alarm at the sound of his hurried footsteps, immediately sensing that something was wrong. "Nathaniel, what is it?" "Vivian knows," he said, breathless, closing the Archive door firmly behind him. "She knows about your birth. Her father found an old steward who remembered the truth. And they have documents, Clara, documents that confirm everything. But they don't intend to reveal the truth honestly. They intend to twist it, to claim you fabricated the entire story, to steal the throne for yourself." Clara's face drained of all color. "They're going to call me a liar, a schemer." "Yes," Nathaniel said grimly. "And if the court believes them before the truth can be properly confirmed and presented, it could destroy any chance you have of ever being recognized as who you truly are. Worse, it could put you in real danger, Clara. People who believe you dangerous, ambitious, capable of forging royal documents, will not hesitate to see you removed from the palace by whatever means necessary." Clara's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of her desk, trying to steady herself against the sudden vertigo of fear washing over her. "We have to tell the Queen. We have to tell her immediately." "Yes," Nathaniel agreed. "Tonight. Before Vivian and her father have the chance to spread their version of the story any further." Together they hurried through the darkened corridors of the palace, moving quickly and quietly to avoid drawing attention, Clara's mind racing with everything Nathaniel had told her. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that the truth could not remain hidden forever, that eventually someone would discover what Margaret had worked so carefully to protect. She had simply hoped for more time, more preparation, more certainty before the world learned who she truly was. That hope, it seemed, had just run out. They reached Queen Margaret's private study to find Edmund already there, deep in conversation with his mother, both of their expressions grave in the flickering candlelight. Margaret looked up sharply as Clara and Nathaniel burst through the door, immediately reading the fear written plainly across their faces. "What has happened?" Margaret asked, rising quickly from her chair. "Vivian knows," Clara said, her voice shaking. "She and her father found proof of who I am, and they intend to twist the truth, to claim I invented the story myself to steal the throne." Edmund's expression darkened with fury. "They would frame you as a liar rather than allow the truth to stand on its own merit." "It is the only path that protects their position," Margaret said grimly, already moving toward her locked cabinet of documents. "If Clara's claim is dismissed as fabrication, then the true bloodline remains conveniently buried, and Vivian's marriage to you proceeds exactly as planned." "Then we cannot allow them to control the story," Edmund said firmly. "We must reveal the truth ourselves, on our own terms, with proof strong enough that no accusation of forgery can stand against it." Margaret nodded slowly, though worry still lined her face. "It will not be simple. Vivian and Harold will fight this with everything they have. But you are right, Edmund. We can no longer afford to wait in silence. The time has come to bring this truth before the full court, whatever the cost may be. Clara stood trembling in the center of the room, surrounded by the three people who now stood ready to fight for her, and felt, for the first time since discovering the truth of her birth, a fragile thread of courage beginning to take root beneath her fear. "Then let us do this properly," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Let us bring the truth into the light before anyone else has the chance to twist it into something it was never meant to be." They spent the remainder of that night planning. The four of them gathered around Margaret's desk as the candles burned lower and lower, mapping out exactly how the truth would be presented, what proof would be required, and who among the court could be trusted to stand as witnesses when the moment finally came. Margaret retrieved every document she had gathered over the past 3 years, spreading them carefully across the desk. There were birth records bearing official seals, correspondence between her and Clara's mother written in careful, guarded language, and most importantly, a formal statement signed by the midwife who had assisted in Clara's secret birth, a statement Margaret had obtained years earlier and kept locked away for exactly this moment. "This alone should be enough to establish the truth beyond reasonable doubt," Margaret said, tapping the midwife's statement. "But Vivian and her father will attempt to claim it forged, just as they intend to claim everything else forged. We need someone with unquestionable credibility to verify these documents publicly, someone whose word the entire court would trust without hesitation." "The Royal Archivist General," Edmund suggested, "Lord Ashby. He has served this family faithfully for 30 years and has no allegiance to Harold or his ambitions." "A wise choice," Margaret agreed. "I will speak with him personally tomorrow, in complete confidence, and ask him to examine these documents before we present anything to the court. His verification will carry weight that our word alone cannot." Clara listened to the planning with a strange, detached feeling, as though she were watching someone else's life unfold rather than her own. Everything happening around her felt too large, too fast, too far removed from the quiet existence she had built for herself among the archive's dusty shelves. She caught Nathaniel's eye across the room, and he offered her a small, steadying smile, the only anchor in the storm that seemed to be gathering around her. "What happens to me if this fails?" Clara asked quietly, the question she had been afraid to voice all evening finally slipping free. "What happens if Vivian and her father convince the court I am lying?" The room fell silent for a moment. It was Edmund who finally spoke, moving to stand beside her, his voice low and steady. "It will not fail, Clara. Not while I am standing beside you to speak the truth of what I know, and not while my mother is willing to stake her own credibility on proving what she has spent 3 years confirming. But even if the court hesitates, even if the path forward proves difficult, I promise you this. I will not allow Harold and Vivian to destroy you simply to protect their own ambitions. Whatever comes, you will not face it alone." Clara felt something in her chest loosen slightly at his words, a warmth she had not allowed herself to feel in days. She looked at Margaret, then at Nathaniel, then finally back at Edmund, and found in each of their faces the same quiet determination. "Then let us move forward," she said, "and let us do it carefully, so that when the truth is finally spoken, no one in that court can find a single thread to unravel it." Margaret nodded with grim satisfaction. "Tomorrow I will speak with Lord Ashby. In the meantime, Clara, you must continue your work in the archive exactly as before, giving Vivian no reason to suspect we already know of her plans. The moment she realizes we are prepared for her accusations, she will only grow more desperate, and desperate people make dangerous choices." Clara nodded, though the thought of facing Vivian again, knowing what she now knew, filled her with a dread she did their best to hide. As the meeting finally drew to a close and Nathaniel walked her back through the darkened corridors toward the archive stairs, she found herself grateful, more than she could express, that she was no longer facing this storm entirely alone. "You were brave tonight," Nathaniel said quietly as they reached her door. "I don't feel brave," Clara admitted. "I feel terrified." "That's exactly what bravery looks like," Nathaniel said gently. Being terrified and moving forward anyway, Clara managed a small, tired smile as she said goodnight. But long after Nathaniel's footsteps faded down the corridor, she lay awake once again, staring at the ceiling, bracing herself for whatever the coming days would bring. The great hall had never felt so crowded as it did the morning Duke Harold requested an emergency audience before the full council. Every noble family in the kingdom summoned on short notice, whispers already rippling through the gathered crowd before the doors had even fully opened. Clara stood near the back of the hall beside Nathaniel, her heart pounding so hard she feared everyone around her could hear it. Margaret had warned her that Harold and Vivian might attempt to strike first, to present their version of events before the truth could be properly established. and it seemed that warning had proven correct. Word had reached Margaret only an hour earlier that Harold intended to make some kind of announcement before the entire court, and there had been no time to do anything but gather what proof they had and hope it would be enough. Edmund stood near the front of the hall beside his mother, his expression carefully composed, though Clara could see the tension coiled in his shoulders from across the room. Vivian stood beside her father, resplendent in a gown of deep purple, her chin lifted with the confident poise of a woman who believed she already held every advantage. "Members of the council," Harold began, his voice carrying easily through the vast hall, "I come before you today with a matter of grave concern regarding the integrity of the royal succession." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Clara felt Nathaniel's hand find hers briefly, a small, steadying gesture hidden from view among the press of bodies. "It has come to my attention," Harold continued, "that a member of the palace staff, a young archivist by the name of Clara Bennett, has been circulating a fabricated claim regarding her own birth, alleging descent from the royal bloodline through a supposedly deceased princess. I have reason to believe this claim is not merely mistaken but deliberately forged, an attempt to insinuate herself into royal favor and disrupt the legitimate succession for personal gain." The hall erupted into startled whispers, heads turning to search the crowd for the young woman in question. Clara felt her face flush hot with humiliation and fear, standing exposed before hundreds of curious eyes, exactly as Harold had intended. "This is a serious accusation to bring before the council without proof," came Margaret's voice, cutting clearly through the murmurs, calm and commanding despite the tension Clara knew she must be feeling. "Do you have evidence to support such a claim, Duke Harold, or merely rumor and speculation?" Harold's smile was thin and confident. "I have testimony, Your Majesty, from servants who witnessed the young woman in question attempting to forge documents in the palace archive, and from a retired steward who recalls no such secret birth ever occurring within this family, despite the girl's claims to the contrary." Clara's stomach dropped. It was a lie, she knew, twisted cleverly from whatever fragments of truth Harold had actually gathered, but standing before the entire court with no chance yet to speak, she felt the accusation land like a physical blow. "I would like to call the accused forward," Harold announced, "so that the council may hear her confess her deception directly." All eyes in the hall turned toward the back where Clara stood frozen, and for a terrible moment, she felt as though her legs had forgotten how to move. It was Nathaniel's quiet, steady voice beside her that finally broke through her paralysis. "Go," he whispered. "You are not alone in this. Walk forward and speak your truth." Clara drew a shaking breath, lifted her chin, and began to walk the long, silent length of the great hall, every step echoing against the marble floor, every eye in the room fixed upon her. She reached the front of the hall and stood facing the council, facing Harold's cold, satisfied smile, facing Vivian's triumphant expression, and finally facing Edmund, whose eyes held nothing but quiet, unwavering support. "Duke Harold's accusation is false," Clara said, her voice trembling but clear enough to carry through the silent hall. "I have never forged a document in my life. Everything I have learned about my birth came from records kept safely by Her Majesty the Queen, records that have now been verified by Lord Ashby, the Royal Archivist General, whose integrity no one in this hall can reasonably question." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd at the mention of Lord Ashby's name. Harold's confident smile faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly. "A convenient claim," he said smoothly, "though I have seen no such verification presented before this council." "Then allow me to present it," came a new voice, and Lord Ashby himself stepped forward from among the gathered nobles, a tall, dignified man with silver hair and a reputation for absolute honesty that had served the crown faithfully for 3 decades. He carried a leather folder, which he opened before the council, presenting the documents Margaret had gathered for careful examination. "I have personally examined these records," Lord Ashby announced, his voice steady and clear. "The birth documentation, the sealed correspondence between Her Majesty and the child's mother, and the signed statement from the attending midwife. Every seal is authentic. Every signature has been verified against known samples from the period. I stake my 30 years of service to this crown on the truth of these documents. Clara Bennett is, without question, the daughter of the princess believed to have died 25 years ago, and by right of blood, stands ahead of Prince Edmund himself in the line of succession." The great hall erupted into chaos, voices rising over one another in shock and disbelief, nobles turning to whisper frantically among themselves, the weight of Lord Ashby's unimpeachable credibility settling over the crowd like a wave no one could deny. Harold's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence crumbling visibly before the entire court. Beside him, Vivian's expression twisted from triumph into something far more desperate. "This is absurd," Vivian said, her voice rising sharply above the murmurs. "Documents can be forged, statements can be coerced. This is nothing more than an elaborate scheme orchestrated by the Queen herself to protect some fabricated bloodline for reasons of her own." "Careful, my lady," Margaret said coldly, stepping forward with the full weight of her royal authority. "You accuse me now of conspiracy alongside Lord Ashby, a man whose loyalty to this crown has never once wavered in 30 years of service. I would think carefully before continuing down that particular path." Vivian's mouth opened, then closed again, the accusation dying on her lips as she realized the precarious position her own words had placed her in. Duke Harold placed a restraining hand on his daughter's arm, his own composure visibly cracking under the weight of the council's growing suspicion. It was in that moment of stunned silence that Edmund stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "There is something more the council should know," he said, and Clara felt her heart stop as she realized what he intended to say. "I have known Clara Bennett for many years, long before any of us understood the truth of her birth. In that time, I came to value her honesty, her integrity, and her quiet wisdom above nearly everyone else in this court. I do not believe, not for a single moment, that she is capable of the deception Duke Harold accuses her of, and I believe, further, that the timing of this accusation, arriving so conveniently before my own wedding, deserves far more scrutiny than the claim it seeks to discredit." A fresh wave of murmurs swept through the hall. Clara looked at Edmund, her eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and fear, aware that he had just publicly aligned himself against the very family he was engaged to marry into. Harold, sensing the tide turning irreversibly against him, made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Your Highness, surely you do not mean to suggest that my daughter and I fabricated this accusation for personal gain?" "I mean to suggest," Edmund said evenly, "that this council deserves a full and impartial investigation into both claims, conducted by Lord Ashby and any others the council deems trustworthy, before any judgment is rendered against Clara Bennett or in favor of continuing my engagement to Lady Vivian." The council chamber fell into a tense, uncertain silence, the weight of Edmund's words settling over the gathered nobles like a verdict already half decided. Clara stood at the center of it all, trembling but upright, aware that the truth of her entire life now hung in the balance of a decision that was no longer entirely hers to make. Margaret raised a hand, calling for order among the murmuring council members. "The council will adjourn to review the evidence presented today. Lord Ashby will oversee a formal investigation into both Clara Bennett's lineage and the circumstances surrounding Duke Harold's accusation. Until that investigation concludes, no further action will be taken regarding the succession, and the royal wedding will be postponed." Vivian's composure finally shattered entirely at those words, her face twisting with fury and disbelief, as she realized how completely her plan had unraveled before the very court she had hoped to impress. She turned on her heel and stormed from the hall without waiting for her father, leaving Harold to offer a stiff, hollow bow toward the council before following after her, his earlier confidence replaced by the ashen look of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time, that he had badly miscalculated. As the hall slowly began to empty, whispers still buzzing among the departing nobles, Clara finally allowed herself to breathe, her legs nearly giving way beneath her from the sheer release of tension. Nathaniel appeared at her side almost instantly, steadying her with a gentle hand at her elbow. "You did it," he said softly. "You stood before the entire court and spoke your truth." "We did it," Clara corrected, glancing toward Margaret and Edmund, who were making their way through the thinning crowd toward her. "None of us could have done this alone." Edmund reached her first, his expression a mixture of relief and something warmer, something he no longer seemed willing to hide, even in the public space of the great hall. "Are you all right?" "I think so," Clara said, managing a small, exhausted smile. "Though I don't know what happens now." "Now," Margaret said, arriving beside them with a rare, satisfied smile of her own, "we allow Lord Ashby to complete his investigation properly, and we prepare this kingdom for a truth it has waited 25 years to hear." Clara looked around the emptying hall, at the marble floors and golden light, at the faces of the people who had stood beside her through the most frightening moment of her life, and felt, for the first time since discovering the truth of her birth, something that almost resembled hope. The investigation Lord Ashby conducted over the following days was thorough almost to the point of exhaustion. Every document Margaret had gathered over the past 3 years was cross-referenced against palace records, provincial birth registries, and the personal correspondence of long-deceased courtiers whose letters had been preserved in the deepest vaults of the royal library. Witnesses were interviewed quietly, away from the prying eyes of the court, their statements recorded and compared for consistency. Clara spent those days in a strange limbo, no longer able to simply return to her quiet work in the archive, yet not fully welcomed into the world of the court either. Servants who had once barely acknowledged her now watched her with open curiosity whenever she passed, some with warmth, others with wary suspicion, uncertain how to treat a woman who might, within days, become the rightful heir to the throne. Clara found the attention almost unbearable, and it was only in the quiet moments spent with Nathaniel, or in the rare private conversations she shared with Edmund, that she felt anything close to like herself. Duke Harold, meanwhile, grew increasingly desperate as the investigation progressed. Word reached Margaret through a nervous young servant who had once worked in Harold's household and still maintained loyalty to the crown, that the Duke had begun making inquiries about ships departing from the northern ports, quiet arrangements that suggested he was preparing an escape should the investigation confirm what everyone now suspected. "He knows the truth is about to be confirmed," Margaret said grimly, sharing this information with Edmund and Clara in her private study. "And a man who knows he is about to lose everything is often the most dangerous kind of man there is." "You believe he might try something," Edmund said, his expression darkening. "I believe we cannot afford to assume otherwise," Margaret replied. "Clara, I want you to remain within the palace walls until this matter is fully resolved. No trips beyond the grounds, no unnecessary risks. Nathaniel, I trust you can help ensure she is never left entirely alone." Nathaniel nodded firmly. "I will not leave her side." Clara appreciated their concern, though the constant careful watching, the sense of danger lurking somewhere just out of sight, wore on her more than she wanted to admit. 3 days later, that danger nearly became devastatingly real. She had gone, against her better judgment but driven by a restless need for the familiar comfort of her old routine, to retrieve a few personal belongings from her room above the archive stairs during a quiet hour of the afternoon. Nathaniel had been called away briefly to assist with an urgent matter in the stables, and Clara, feeling foolish for needing an escort for such a simple errand, had told him she would be perfectly safe for the short walk. She was wrong. As she climbed the narrow stairs toward her room, she became aware of footsteps behind her, deliberate and unhurried, and when she turned, she found herself face to face with a man she did not recognize, tall and grim-faced, dressed in the plain clothing of a hired hand rather than palace staff. "Miss Bennet," the man said, his voice low and unsettling. "The Duke sends his regards, and a strong suggestion that you consider a long journey away from this palace, for your own safety." Clara's heart pounded with sudden fear, but she forced her voice to remain steady, refusing to let him see how badly her hands had begun to shake. "I have no intention of going anywhere." "That would be unwise," the man said, taking a slow step closer, and for a terrifying moment Clara believed he intended to force the matter physically. She backed toward the wall, her mind racing for any avenue of escape, when a sharp voice rang out from the bottom of the stairwell. "Step away from her." Nathaniel stood at the base of the stairs, having returned early from the stables and sensing something wrong, the moment he found Clara's room empty. Behind him, 2 palace guards, alerted by his urgent call, moved swiftly up the stairs. The stranger's confidence faltered at the sight of reinforcements, and after a brief, tense standoff, he turned and fled down a side passage, disappearing into the palace's warren of servant corridors before the guards could apprehend him. Clara sank against the wall, her legs finally giving out beneath the sudden release of fear, and Nathaniel reached her side in an instant, steadying her with careful, gentle hands. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his eyes searching her face. "No," Clara managed, though her voice trembled badly. "No, I'm all right. He only threatened me. He didn't touch me." Nathaniel's expression remained tight with fury and residual fear even as relief washed visibly over him. "I should never have let you walk here alone." "It isn't your fault," Clara said, though she found herself grateful beyond words for his timely return. "I insisted I would be fine." When word of the incident reached Margaret and Edmund, the response was immediate and severe. Guards were doubled around Clara at all times, and Lord Ashby's investigation was quietly expanded to include tracing the hired man's connection back to Duke Harold, a connection that, once uncovered through careful questioning of the northern port officials Harold had been corresponding with, proved damning beyond any reasonable doubt. Faced with mounting evidence of both his daughter's false accusation and his own attempt to intimidate the rightful heir into fleeing the kingdom, Duke Harold's position collapsed entirely. Within a week, Lord Ashby presented his final findings before the full council, findings that confirmed, beyond any remaining doubt, both the truth of Clara's royal bloodline and the depth of Harold's desperate scheme to prevent that truth from ever coming to light. Vivian's engagement to Edmund was formally dissolved the same day, the council unanimous in their judgment that a woman whose family had attempted such treachery against the rightful heir could not be permitted to marry into the royal line. Duke Harold was stripped of his title and his lands, his attempt to flee the kingdom intercepted at the northern port just hours before he might have escaped entirely. Clara, standing once more before the great hall, this time not as an accused fraud but as a confirmed and rightful heir, felt the weight of everything that had happened settle over her not as fear, but as something closer to quiet, disbelieving relief. The truth, buried for 25 years, had finally survived long enough to be spoken in full daylight, and nothing in the kingdom would ever be quite the same again. The morning of the coronation dawned bright and clear over the palace, sunlight spilling gold across the courtyard where crowds had gathered since before dawn, eager for a glimpse of the ceremony that would soon unfold within the great hall. News of the truth, the hidden princess found after 25 years, the false accusation exposed, the treacherous duke stripped of his title, had spread through the kingdom like wildfire in the weeks since the council's judgment. Everyone wanted to see, with their own eyes, the woman who had gone from a quiet archivist to the rightful heir of the throne. Inside the palace, Clara stood in a private chamber, staring at her own reflection in a tall mirror, hardly recognizing the woman looking back at her. She wore a gown of deep blue silk, simple compared to the elaborate designs Vivian had once favored, but elegant in a way that felt entirely her own, chosen carefully by Margaret to reflect both royal dignity and the quiet grace that had always been Clara's true nature. "You look every bit the princess you were always meant to be," Margaret said softly, entering the room and studying Clara with an expression of quiet pride. "I still don't quite believe it," Clara admitted, smoothing the fabric of her gown with nervous hands. "A month ago I was cataloging old letters in the archive. Now I'm about to be crowned before the entire kingdom." Margaret moved to stand beside her, placing a gentle hand over Clara's trembling ones. "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you have become, Clara. Not because of the crown you are about to receive, but because of the courage you showed in claiming the truth of who you are, even when that truth arrived wrapped in danger and uncertainty." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, though she blinked them back, unwilling to let them fall before the ceremony had even begun. "Thank you, for everything you did to protect me all these years, even when I didn't know you were doing it." "It was the least I could do," Margaret said, her own eyes bright with emotion. "Now, come, the kingdom is waiting." They walked together through the palace corridors, Nathaniel falling into step beside them as they passed the archive stairs, dressed in fine clothing that felt unfamiliar on his frame, but that he wore with quiet dignity nonetheless. He had remained close to Clara through every step of the tumultuous weeks since the truth had come to light, and Margaret had ensured he would stand among the honored guests at the ceremony, recognizing the vital role he had played in protecting Clara when danger had come knocking. "Nervous?" he asked, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "Terrified," Clara admitted, "but less terrified than I was standing in that great hall facing Harold's accusations." "You'll be wonderful," Nathaniel said with quiet confidence. "You always have been, even when you didn't believe it yourself." They reached the entrance to the great hall, and through the heavy wooden doors, Clara could hear the low murmur of hundreds of gathered nobles and dignitaries, could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her chest like a physical thing. Edmund appeared from a side corridor just as the doors began to open, dressed in formal royal attire, his eyes finding hers immediately across the small distance between them. "Ready?" he asked softly, stepping close enough that only she could hear him. "I don't know," Clara admitted honestly. "But I suppose that's never stopped me before." Edmund's expression softened into something warm and genuine. "Whatever happens in there, Clara, know that I stand beside you, not as a prince offering duty to a newly discovered cousin, but as a man who has loved you for longer than either of us ever allowed ourselves to admit." Clara's breath caught, her heart swelling with an emotion she had spent years carefully suppressing, believing it could never be allowed to bloom into anything real. "Edmund, we can speak of it properly after the ceremony," he said gently, though his eyes carried a promise that made her pulse quicken. "For now, the kingdom awaits its true heir." The great doors swung open fully, and Clara stepped forward into the hall, sunlight streaming through the tall stained glass windows overhead, casting colored light across the gathered crowd who turned as one to watch her approach. She walked the long aisle toward the raised dais at the front of the hall, her chin lifted, her steps steady despite the trembling she felt deep in her chest, Margaret and Edmund flanking her on either side, Nathaniel among the honored guests near the front, his eyes never leaving her. Lord Ashby stood waiting at the dais, the ceremonial crown resting on a velvet cushion beside him, its jewels catching the light in brilliant flashes of color. Clara climbed the few steps to stand before him, and the great hall fell into reverent silence as he began to speak the formal words of the coronation ceremony, words that had been spoken for generations before rightful heirs to the throne, words that Clara had never once imagined would be spoken for her. Clara, daughter of the true bloodline, hidden for 25 years, to protect her from those who would see her erased from history. Do you accept the crown and the responsibility it carries? To rule this kingdom with wisdom, with justice, and with the same courage you have already shown in claiming the truth of your own identity. Clara's voice, when she finally spoke, carried clearly through the silent hall, steadier than she believed possible. I do. Lord Ashby lifted the crown carefully from its velvet cushion and, with reverent hands, placed it upon Clara's head. The weight of it settled against her, heavier than she expected, both physically and in the sense of everything it now represented. 25 years of hidden truth finally brought into the light. A bloodline nearly erased, now restored to its rightful place. The great hall erupted into thunderous applause, nobles and commoners alike rising to their feet, the sound echoing off the high stone ceiling like a wave of long-overdue celebration. Clara stood at the center of it all, tears finally slipping free down her cheeks, no longer tears of fear or grief but of overwhelming, disbelieving joy. She looked out across the crowd and found Nathaniel first, his face split into a wide, proud smile, his eyes bright with unshed tears of his own. Beside him, she saw the faces of servants and nobles alike, people who had once overlooked her entirely now watching her with open admiration and respect. And finally, she turned to find Edmund standing just beside the dais, his expression full of a love he no longer had any reason to hide. He stepped forward and knelt before her, the same formal gesture every noble in the hall had already begun to offer, but in his eyes, Clara saw something far more personal than mere royal protocol. Your Majesty, he said, his voice carrying just far enough for those nearest to hear, though his eyes never left hers. I pledge my loyalty to you, not merely as your cousin and your subject, but as a man who intends to spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy of standing beside you, if you will have me. The hall fell into a hush of surprised anticipation, and Clara felt her heart swell with an emotion so full she could hardly contain it. She reached down and took his hand, drawing him back to his feet before the entire watching court. I would have no one else beside me, she said softly, her voice trembling with happiness rather than fear. The applause that followed was even louder than before, the entire hall erupting into joyful celebration at the sight of their new queen, and the prince who had loved her long before either of them understood the truth that had always bound them together. Somewhere in the crowd, Clara caught sight of Margaret, tears of pride streaming freely down her face, and felt a profound gratitude for the woman who had protected her secret for 25 years and finally helped bring it safely into the light. As the ceremony drew to its joyful close and the crowd began to disperse into the courtyard for the celebrations that would continue long into the evening, Clara stood for a quiet moment at the top of the dais, looking out over the kingdom she had never expected to inherit, the crown resting steady upon her head. She thought of the archive where she had spent so many quiet years, of the letter hidden in her mother's journal, of the terrifying night she had learned the truth of her own identity, of the danger she had faced and the courage she had found to stand before the entire court and claim her rightful place. She thought of her mother, who had loved her enough to let her go, and of Margaret, who had protected that love in silence for 25 long years. Most of all, she thought of how far she had traveled from the quiet, overlooked woman who had once stood at the edge of a ballroom, watching the man she loved announce his engagement to another, believing her own heart would never matter to anyone beyond herself. She had been wrong. Her heart, and the truth it had always known, had mattered more than she ever could have imagined. Clara Bennett, once nothing more than a name in a dusty archive ledger, stood now as the rightful queen of the kingdom, a crown upon her head and the man she loved standing steady beside her, ready to begin a new chapter neither of them could have predicted, but one they would face together, exactly as they were always meant to. In the weeks that followed the coronation, Clara found herself learning an entirely new rhythm of life, one filled with council meetings and formal audiences, with advisors eager to guide her through the complexities of governing a kingdom she had never expected to lead. It was overwhelming at times, the sheer weight of responsibility settling over her in quiet moments when the crowds had gone and she sat alone in the study that had once belonged to Margaret, now hers to occupy as the reigning queen. But she was not entirely alone in learning this new life. Margaret remained close at hand, offering guidance drawn from decades of experience, never overbearing, always patient, treating Clara not as a burden she had inherited but as the daughter she had quietly protected, and now finally welcomed fully into the family. Edmund, too, remained steadily beside her, not simply as the man who loved her, but as a genuine partner in the work of ruling, his years of training as heir now put toward supporting rather than claiming the throne itself. "You handled the trade dispute with the eastern provinces better than I would have," Edmund told her one evening, as they walked together through the palace gardens after a particularly long council session, the last light of evening painting the sky in soft shades of orange and purple. "I still feel like I'm guessing half the time," Clara admitted with a tired laugh. "Everyone feels that way when they first take the crown," Edmund said. "I remember watching my father wrestle with the same uncertainty when I was young, though he never let anyone outside our family see it. You're doing better than you realize, Clara." She smiled at him, grateful beyond words for his steady presence through the whirlwind of change that had reshaped her entire life. "I couldn't do any of this without you, without your mother, without Nathaniel." "You won't have to," Edmund said simply, taking her hand as they walked. "None of us intend to go anywhere." Nathaniel, for his part, had been offered a formal position within the palace administration, a role that recognized both his loyalty and the courage he had shown in protecting Clara through the most dangerous days of her transformation from archivist to queen. He accepted with quiet gratitude, though he insisted on maintaining his connection to the gardens he had tended since childhood, unwilling to abandon entirely the simple work that had always grounded him. "You could have any position in this palace," Clara told him one afternoon, finding him exactly where she expected, tending carefully to a bed of roses near the old stone wall, where they had once sat together as children. "Yet you choose to keep pulling weeds." Nathaniel looked up at her with an easy smile, brushing dirt from his hands as he rose to greet her. "Some things are worth holding on to, Your Majesty, even when the rest of your life changes entirely around them." Clara laughed, the sound light and genuine, so different from the careful, guarded laughter she had allowed herself in the early days after discovering the truth of her birth. "You're the only person in this entire palace who still refuses to bow to me properly." "I'll bow when you stop climbing over that garden wall to escape your council meetings," Nathaniel said, arching an eyebrow, and Clara felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with royal duty, and everything to do with the simple, steady friendship that had carried her through the hardest days of her life. As the months passed, the kingdom slowly grew accustomed to its new queen, the initial shock of Clara's extraordinary story settling into quiet acceptance and, gradually, genuine affection. She ruled with the same careful diligence she had once brought to organizing the palace archive, listening more than she spoke, weighing every decision with the thoughtful patience of a woman who understood, perhaps better than any queen before her, what it meant to have one's entire identity questioned, and ultimately proven true through careful, patient truth-telling. Duke Harold's lands were redistributed among families who had remained loyal through the crisis, a decision Clara made not out of vengeance but out of practical necessity, ensuring the kingdom's stability moving forward. Vivian, stripped of her title alongside her father, disappeared from court entirely, rumored to have taken refuge with distant relatives in a quiet province far from the capital, her ambitions finally, permanently extinguished by the truth she had tried so desperately to bury. Clara thought of her rarely, and when she did, it was with something closer to quiet pity than lingering resentment. She understood now, more than she ever had before, how easily ambition could twist a person's heart when they believed power was the only measure of their worth. On a warm evening nearly a year after her coronation, Clara stood once again on the balcony overlooking the palace gardens, Edmund beside her, the crown resting comfortably now upon her head, in a way it had not in those first uncertain weeks. Below them, the gardens stretched green and peaceful in the fading light, the same gardens where Nathaniel still tended his roses, the same walls where she had once sat as a frightened young woman, uncertain of her place in the world. "Do you ever think about that night?" Edmund asked quietly, watching the last light fade over the horizon. "The ball, when I made the announcement, when Vivian said those things to you?" Clara considered the question for a long moment. "Sometimes, but I don't think of it with pain anymore. I think of it as the beginning of everything, even though it didn't feel that way at the time. If that night had never happened exactly as it did, I don't know if the truth would have ever found its way to the surface." Edmund turned to look at her, his expression soft with quiet wonder. "I am endlessly grateful it did. Grateful for every difficult step that led us here, standing together, exactly where we were always meant to be." Clara reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his as they stood together, watching the stars begin to emerge over the kingdom she now called her own to protect. So am I, she said softly. So am I. 2 years into her reign, Clara received a letter that arrived without any royal seal, delivered instead by an ordinary courier who insisted it be placed directly into the Queen's hands. She recognized the handwriting the moment she broke the plain wax seal, careful and cramped, unmistakably belonging to a woman she had not thought of in a long while. Vivian's letter was brief, stripped of the sharp confidence that had once defined every word she spoke. She wrote from the quiet province where she had settled after her family's fall from favor, describing a life far removed from palace intrigue, one spent teaching young children their letters in a small village schoolhouse. She did not ask for forgiveness outright, nor did she attempt to excuse the harm she had caused. She wrote only that she wished Clara to know she finally understood, after 2 years of quiet reflection, how much damage ambition without conscience could cause, and that she hoped, in whatever small way possible, to live the remainder of her life making amends for the person she had once been. Clara read the letter twice, sitting alone in her study as the afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt no anger reading it, only a distant, tempered sympathy for a woman who had learned too late what truly mattered. She did not write back immediately. Instead, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, uncertain what response, if any, would be appropriate, and turned her attention back to the stack of council documents waiting on her desk, matters of trade agreements and provincial disputes that required her full attention. It was Margaret who found her there later that evening, still bent over her paperwork long after most of the palace had settled into evening quiet.
"You work too hard,"
Margaret said gently, settling into the chair across from Clara's desk with the ease of long familiarity.
"Even queens are permitted rest."
Clara smiled tiredly, setting down her pen. "There is always so much to learn. Some days I still feel like the archivist I once was, buried under papers, trying to make sense of everything at once." "That feeling never entirely disappears," Margaret admitted. "I felt it myself for years after I first became queen consort. But you have grown remarkably steady in your role, Clara. The kingdom trusts you, and more importantly, you have begun to trust yourself." Clara considered this for a moment, then reached into her drawer and withdrew Vivian's letter, sliding it across the desk toward Margaret. "I received this today, from Vivian." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly as she read through the brief letter, her expression thoughtful rather than surprised. "What do you intend to do with it?" "I don't know," Clara admitted. "Part of me wants to simply let it go, to leave that entire chapter of my life behind without another word exchanged. But another part of me remembers what it felt like to be dismissed, to be told my truth did not matter simply because it was inconvenient for someone else's ambitions. I don't want to become the kind of ruler who refuses to acknowledge growth in others, even those who once wronged me." "That is a wise instinct," Margaret said. "Mercy, offered thoughtfully, is often a greater strength than punishment prolonged unnecessarily. But you need not decide tonight. Sit with the question a while longer, and the right answer will reveal itself in time." Clara nodded, grateful as always for her mother-by-law's steady wisdom, and the conversation drifted naturally toward lighter matters: the upcoming harvest festival, a proposal from the eastern provinces regarding new trade routes, small details of governance that had become, over 2 years, comfortably familiar rather than overwhelming. Later that night, after Margaret had retired and the palace had settled fully into silence, Clara found herself walking through the gardens alone, drawn by habit toward the old stone wall where she and Nathaniel had once spent countless childhood afternoons. She found him there even now, tending quietly to a late-blooming rose bush by lantern light, exactly as she somehow always expected to find him. "You're up late," she said, settling onto the low wall beside him. "Roses don't care what time it is when they need attention," Nathaniel said with a small smile, brushing dirt from his hands as he joined her on the wall. "Something troubling you, Your Majesty?" Clara smiled at the familiar teasing title, though there was genuine warmth behind his question. "I received a letter from Vivian today." Nathaniel's expression sobered slightly. "How do you feel about that?" "Uncertain," Clara admitted. "She wrote that she has changed, that she understands now the harm her ambition caused. Part of me wants to believe her. Part of me remembers standing in that great hall, accused of lies and forgery, terrified for my own safety." "Both feelings can be true at once," Nathaniel said gently. "You can extend compassion to who she might be becoming, while still holding clear memory of who she was. Forgiveness doesn't require forgetting, Clara. It only requires choosing not to let old harm control your present peace." Clara looked at him, struck, as she often was, by the quiet depth of his understanding. "When did you become so wise?" Nathaniel laughed softly. I've always been wise. You were simply too busy running from council meetings to notice." She laughed too, the sound easy and unguarded in the quiet garden, and for a long moment they sat together in comfortable silence, the same silence that had carried them through childhood, through crisis, through the strange and winding path that had led Clara from a dusty archive to a royal crown. "I think I will write back to her," Clara said finally. "Not to invite her back to court, not yet, perhaps not ever, but to acknowledge her letter, to tell her that growth, when genuine, deserves to be recognized, even from a distance." Nathaniel nodded approvingly. "That sounds like exactly the kind of queen you were always meant to become." Clara looked up at the stars scattered across the dark sky above the palace, thinking of everything that had brought her to this quiet moment, the ballroom announcement that had once broken her heart, the hidden letter in her mother's journal, the frightening night in Margaret's study when her entire world had shifted beneath her feet, the accusations and the danger and the trembling courage it had taken to stand before an entire court and claim the truth of who she was. She thought of her mother, who had loved her enough to let her go, and of the 25 years of silence Margaret had carried to keep that love safe. She thought of Edmund, waiting for her even now somewhere within the palace walls, steady and unwavering through every storm they had weathered together. And she thought of Nathaniel, sitting quietly beside her exactly as he always had, the constant, grounding presence who had never once wavered, not through humiliation, not through danger, not through the dizzying transformation from archivist to queen. "Thank you," she said softly, "for staying beside me through all of it." Nathaniel glanced at her, something warm and unspoken passing between them in the lantern light. "There was never anywhere else I intended to be, Clara, not then, and not now." She smiled, and together they sat beneath the quiet stars, two old friends who had weathered a storm neither of them could have predicted, watching over a kingdom that had finally, after 25 long years of hidden truth, found its way into the steady light of honesty, courage, and a crown worn not out of ambition, but out of quiet, hard-won grace.